projects, low cost affordable housing schemes, and has acquired extensive knowledge and strong technical ability in the area of conceptual design and seismic analysis. He has successfully led and delivered number of projects from concepts to construction, as well as peer reviews in Asia, Pacific region, Middle East, and USA. His well-known projects in India are Godrej Sector 43, Noida, Godrej Taj Hotel, Mumbai, Zoo Enclosures, Mumbai, Puranics Abbey Tenet, Pune, then Celestia Spaces in Mumbai, DY Patil University Hospital, New Mumbai, then international projects such as MC Nair postdocs at USA, National Bank of Abu Dhabi headquarters in Dubai, UAE, King Abdullah Financial District at Riyadh, Pacific Tower at Citrus, and Civic Heart Hospital in Australia. He has number of projects. The list would be very bigger, and it's short time for me to introduce all his projects. But if you go to his website, you will understand the kind of intensive work he has done in the field of structural design and high-rise building. So today's lecture will focus more mainly on structural design consideration for high-rise building, because our students are having the projects of housing in Pune, and this thing knowledge sharing would help our students a lot. So I give the further mic towards our honorable guest. And once again, welcome Aditya Karveji to our institute and our college. On behalf of Pimpri Education Trust, I once again humbly request you to go further for your webinar, and I welcome you again, sir. I also personally call you to the college so you can have more better view about our project, our college works, and the thirst our faculty do have to share knowledge with the students, because we consider our profession as a noble profession of teaching, and we have taken oath that our students are the future architects of India, who will work across the country globally and make our nation bigger. So we dedicate this thing to you, sir. Thank you so much, and welcome once again.
Thank you, sir, and good morning, all of you. First of all, I would like to thank you and your college for inviting me to share my experiences on this platform in structural design of tall buildings. Uh, uh, Almost entire this presentation is focused towards architectural students who are learning the principles of planning, amongst other things. And like the architect holds the most important position in any project, and overall, in our transforming our society. And they are like at the top of the pyramid when it comes to the design and execution team. And it would be great that I can share everything that's related to the structural design that happens in tall buildings. And I hope these experiences and the concept that I share, their knowledge is enhanced by this, and they become more better architects. With this, let me share my presentation.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so is my screen visible?
Yes, sir.
Okay, all right. The focus on this presentation is tall buildings and the various structural design considerations that we need to give. I'll briefly take you through the contents of this presentation. This presentation will take you through like what is an ideal definition of a tall building, uh, uh, what are the relative structural costs in play, what are the lateral load premiums that we need to pay. We start from loads, what kind of loads a tall building is subjected to, what are the materials are at play in the market, what are the various systems such as the vertical load resisting system, lateral load resisting systems in play for resisting the loads. We'll go through what's the importance of the core of the structure, the various buildability aspects, the logistics, and the prevalent construction technology. Uh, Tall buildings have some unique problems which we don't see in shorter buildings or mid-rise buildings, such as axial shortening. I'll talk to you about that in brief. What are the type of foundations that are involved? Many times we have a non-tower area, which is less number of floors that is connected to the tower from the functionality point of view. So I'll take you through what are the aspects of the non-tower and the connections that happen with the tower that would aid in planning. In 2017, the Bureau of Indian Standards came up with this tall building code, IS 16700. This is a more generic code, a prescriptive code for structural engineers. However, they have done a really great job, in giving quite useful information in the code, which even an architect or other members of the design team can go through them and have a good understanding of it. And it's a very important code. So I'll take you through some important aspects of that code that an architect needs to know, or an architect is well equipped if he or she knows it. And then I'll give you a couple of examples of some tall building projects. Questions anytime are welcome, or you can post it in the chat window and I can take it at the end of the session, whatever works. So let's see how do you define a tall building? So how tall is tall, or rather what is the magic height? So like in this photograph, there are number of buildings that appear to be tall. Some are really tall, but then what is that line which says that, okay, now this is called a tall building? What is that height? So in reality, there is no such magic height or clear-cut definition in place. Usually it depends on various factors, and the most important factor is that the time when the structural design, it moves from the field of statics to the field of dynamics, uh, uh, and the effect of lateral loads, and particularly wind, they begin to dominate. That's when we say that a building is tall enough. Now, what is this lateral load? While I describe the effects of lateral load and what are the things to be catered to in the subsequent slides, but let us see why these lateral loads are important. So this particular figure, explains it quite aptly. So what I've done is I have distributed the components into three. One is the floor system, which is in the pink, the cost of the gravity columns, which is in green, and then the blue is the lateral load resisting system cost per unit area. So as you can see, like a floor system, whether it's a flat slab or a beam slab system or any slab, whether it's 10 floors or 50 floors, the cost of that floor system is almost same at every floor. And whereas the cost of the gravity columns is linear, it increases linearly with height. Whenever a story gets added, if n stories get added, n number times repeated load gets added. So it's a linear function. Whereas the overturning moment that happens at the base of the structure due to the lateral loads or wind, you see it usually increases in proportion to the square of the height. So that's quite an exponential distribution. And also the deflections increase in proportion to the fourth power of the height. So that is the impact of lateral load. Okay, and this premium that you need to pay for lateral load, it's usually seen somewhere around 25 to 30 stories. When the building number of stories exceed 30 stories, that's when the curve diverges, and that's when there is a huge premium. And to just give you an example of an idea of numbers, so the structural cost is roughly 20 to 30% of the total building cost, and the cost of bracing, the lateral bracing of the structure is like at a further 30% of the structural cost. So that's like 7 to 10% of the total building cost. That's a huge premium you got to pay for the lateral bracing. And hence, we need to have an efficient lateral load resisting system in our building. And there are certain key decisions that we need to take on very early on in the project, at the very concept or pre-concept stage rather, sitting with all stakeholders, and that's where we fix the lateral system. And it's not just about the quantity consumption of the lateral system. There are various cascading effects, and we'll see this in the slides further ahead in the presentation. So before that, this is an example sketch of a tall building that's constructed some in the world. Let's look at what kind of loads this building is subjected to. So starting with its own gravity load, the self-weight, the finishes, the live loads, we have the wind loads, then there will be maybe some accidental loads that may happen. The settlement of soil or the foundations that can cause additional loads on the structure. Then we have the seismic loads, or depending if the building is built in concrete, the concrete has a tendency to shrink, and the shrinkage, when concrete tries to shrink, depending on the restraints that are there in the building, there may be some additional loads imparted on the structure. And one is load from temperature. There are a lot of loads that are applied on the building, and as a structural engineer, our design codes are robust enough where we design the building for all these type of load envelopes. The critical ones that I'll take forward is the wind and seismic. So let us understand what happens in a tall tower when subjected to wind. So usually when the wind flows around a tall building, you have two components. One is the along wind component, which we call as a drag, and the transverse there, as it flows around whatever shape the building has. It also, there is a component called as crosswind, or the transverse, in the transverse direction. And this kind of loading is really critical, or rather it's like an kind of an additive load, and which comes into play when the building is tall, or when the building is flexible. And these wind loads are not only a function of the exposure, they are also a function of the flexibility of the building and what kind of damping we have in the building. And these are the two main components that are critical in a tall building. So a designer may have a 50-story building with, say, X flexibility, which is stable, or he or she may come up with a 2X flexibility, which is still stable, or a X by 2 flexibility, which is still stable. But these two similar buildings in height and same geometry properties, depending on the flexibility, the building, it interacts with the wind, and it attracts different kind of loads. These wind loads are necessary to have the strength. Not only the strength, it's the serviceability checks that need to be done. And when we talk about serviceability, it's either drift limits or acceleration limits. Now, drift limits are important because you have the facade, the vertical MEP services, and the vertical transportation, such as elevators. They need to be in place and functional. A building that has excessive drifts will damage, or will have cascading damage on these non-structural components. So although the building is safe, it's will be out of function if there is a racking in the facade, or if the services go out of plumb. So we cannot let that happen. So that's where the drift limits come in. And then in a tall building, you also have acceleration limits. So acceleration is something that's related to human comfort. So just imagine a person at the 50th story, or at the 60th or the 100th story. That person should be comfortable when they're staying in their apartment. There shouldn't be much, the acceleration of that particular tower should be within limits, and we'll see that further. And many times, depending on the requirements, we may need to go for various mitigation strategies, and that's where the role of the wind consultant come into the picture. They guide us on what could be the shape of the building. So buildings with different shapes attract different wind loads. Whether any supplemental damping is required to reduce acceleration, or sometimes, depending on the cost benefit analysis, obviously, sometimes you also see a floor dedicated for allowing the wind to pass through the structure, which is called a wind floor. So people may plan a wind floor in that case. However, everything has a cost associated with it, and that's where high level decisions need to be taken. As I said, like a supplemental damping may be in terms of, either a tune mass damper or a pendulum hanging. It's like a hanging pendulum with huge mass at the roof of the structure, or a damper brace sometime, or a liquid water tank, which is a sloshing damper. These apparatus usually help in damping out the accelerations. Generally speaking, a slenderness ratio of the tower, which is if it's in the range of maximum 13:1, it's usually considered quite okay, and it may not be required to go for these special measures. So this is a ballpark figure, not something that is set in stone, but generally from experience. Now, what happens or what is the process of wind load determination? So there are two things. One is we always have the building codes. The building codes are like analytical or prescriptive in nature. They have always been there. They give a good guidance which we can take help of in the very concept level. But ultimately, for tall buildings, it is best to go for a wind tunnel procedure. So what happens is the figure on the left, they scale the model of the building and they place it in the wind tunnel to get the actual values. Depending on the neighborhood development or future development, the wind tunnel consultant will do multiple cases with and without the surroundings, and they give us the loads that are more accurate. This method is more accurate than the prescriptive code. There is obviously an additional expense associated with this method. However, this expense is usually justified because generally speaking, the loads come out to be less than the resulting prescriptive norms. It's again a general statement. It's this is like majority of the times what we have observed. However, more importantly, forget less or more, it's a more accurate method. So that is more important. Even if the wind loads are more, it's beneficial for you to understand why they are more and the reason they are more, so that the building is safe. One of the this is what I was talking about earlier, the figure on the right. So the figure on the right, on the x-axis, I have a building flexibility. So as I move from the left towards the right of the x-axis, the building flexibility increases. And the wind tunnel consultant, they provide us these curves at various damping ratios. So the black curve is at 2% damping, the two blue curves are at 3 and 3.5% damping. And on the y-axis, we have the overturning moments. So if you see, there is a sweet spot, somewhere the peak is reached somewhere around a flexibility equivalent of 9.9 seconds. Here time period, that's when the structure attracts the maximum load. And using this information, the structural engineer can, sharpen their pencils. Like that, if they want to reduce the wind load, what they need to do, either go towards increase the flexibility more than 9.9 seconds, that's where the curve begins to drop, or reduce the flexibility and go towards the left side of the curve, where again the floor where the curve begins to drop and the wind demands begin to drop. This is very important to know, and that's what the wind tunnel consultant provides us. This is a typical sketch of a motion perception. So acceleration.
Excuse me, sir.
Mhm.
Kindly Kindly you explain about the what is the slenderness ratio that you mentioned in the
Sure,
earlier
sure.
slide.
Sure. So the slenderness ratio 13:1, that's the ratio of the height of the tower to the base dimension. So what we call as the h by b ratio. So h is the total height and b is the base width. Uh, this curve is a typical, limits on the acceleration at the top. Accelerations are always going to be there, but there's a lot of research being done. And finally, what do people, perceive? That is important. So that's where for residential buildings, it's around 17 millig, and for commercial buildings, it's around 22.5 millig. And this needs to be checked for a lower return period. So lower return period is a 10-year interval. So a return period is a mathematical term, but to make a layman understand, lower the return period means it's the more frequent that particular wind comes or a windstorm comes. So when we design the building, it will be for like a 700 or a 1000-year return period. So it's a very rare event, and that's where the strength comes into the picture. So in case we have a rare event, an event that occurs once in 700 years or once in 1000 years or 1500 years, the building must not uh, fail. That's the ultimate goal. Whereas when it comes to acceleration, people are living there on a day-to-day basis, and for a commercial complex, people are using it on a daily basis. So the winds are something that happen daily, and for that we take a 10-year recurring interval. So that's a more frequent, common, less intensity wind for which the accelerations or the motion perception has to be checked. There is also the shape of the tower that plays a role. Like, you know, I am these two figures really talk about that. So the figure to the left and the figure to the right, if you see, the figure to the right is a cruciform shape, and the figure to the left is a perfectly square shape. If you look at the exposed area, the exposure is the same in both cases, and the wind load attracted by each tower is more or less similar. But just keep in mind that in the cruciform shape, there are these areas that are missed out, which are filled up in the square shape. And it's basically you're selling more area for the same, almost similar wind load. So that's where, there is a ratio which is called the perimeter to area ratio. So obviously, if you are focusing on economy of a tall building, the shape of the building has high impact. Cruciform shapes have limited sellable area for the same wind load. And obviously, from economy point of view, a lesser P by A ratio is usually desirable. Apart from that, if buildings are really tall, there is a concept of aerodynamic shaping that happens. So a building, a square building with sharp corners, or whether the building needs to be given chamfers, or whether any balconies are there, whether the balconies have to be chamfered, or if any openings have to be given in the balconies. These discussions need to happen with the wind tunnel consultant. They give good guidance as to how does a shape of a building, making small adjustments in the exterior shape, roughening the edges or smoothing the edges, how the wind loads get impacted by that. So these are the discussions we usually need to take place with the wind tunnel consultant. So this is a brief process of the wind tunnel. So what happens is there is a construction of scaled model with surroundings. The model is done with and without the proposed phase development. And experts give us forces for design to be used for design. They take into account whatever is the wind climate study, whatever is the local topography, the directions they see around all 360 degrees. and also the dynamic effects. They provide us wind forces for the cladding. The cladding needs to be designed for higher pressures than what the building is subjected to. They also provide a sensitivity studies. So the graph that I showed earlier, like whether we want to increase our flexibility or decrease our flexibility, or whether damping needs to be increased or decreased. These are the sensitivity studies they do for us. They provide us loads for different recurrence period, 50, 20, 10, even higher, 700, 1500 years. They comment on mitigation strategies, as I talked before, whether any extra damping is required, whether chamfers need to be given, whether any particular geometry change has to be done, whether any wind floor has to be incorporated, and so on. And also they provide us results of pedestrian wind study. Sometimes you have these high rise podium floors where you have the amenities and all which are exposed, and people walk on it, and sometimes the lot of wind eddies are formed there due to setback between the tower and non-tower. That's when the pedestrian comfort study also comes into the play. Moving on to seismic loads, one thing to, and this is a very basic slide from understanding point of view. So earthquakes are not really, they do not apply any external forces. These are internally generated inertial forces. As the ground moves, the building follows its movement, and whatever is the mass of the building, heavier the mass of the building, higher is the force, as it's an inertial force. Everybody knows what's Newton's law of motion, mass into acceleration. So higher the mass, higher the force. They are a function of the location, whatever is the occupancy class, whether it's highly occupied or not, depends on the soil conditions, what is the structural system in place, the height of the building, the plan layout, and the mass distribution. The whole objective of a seismic design compared to if you compare it with wind design, the objectives are quite different. Like in seismic design, the whole objective is to prevent collapse of the structure due to extreme high earthquakes and preserve life safety. The objectives are not to limit damage. Damage is always going to happen when a seismic event comes. But the whole idea is that the functionality of the building needs to be maintained. For very low intensity earthquakes, damage should be really, really minimal, and for whatever purpose the building is used for, that need not be hindered. And for moderate earthquakes, the damages should be repairable. These are the aims of seismic design. I'll give you a brief understanding of the materials. This is a historic data in the construction of tall buildings. So what we have picked is the 100 tallest buildings year by year. So from 1930 to 2014. And if you see in the early decades, these blue graphs, most of the tall buildings were done in structural steel. Later on, somewhere around from 1980s and onwards, the influence of concrete started increasing. That's when more and more advancements were done in concrete technology. A really high strength concrete could be made, and also concrete, if you see, it's a readily locally sourced material, and construction can begin immediately, doesn't have a lead time associated with it as compared to prefabricated materials like steel. That is the advantage. And then later there was a mix and match, or marrying the two trades, the steel and concrete, and that's when even the composite buildings came to be used as the tower heights kept on increasing. So it's like using best of the both worlds, and that's what the historic data tells us. Regarding concrete and reinforcement, there is, if you see, there's a lot of changes that have come. In the 1960s, it was just 60 KSI reinforcing that was allowed by the code. 60 KSI somewhere like on our Indian counterpart, it is like a grade FE415. And later, like the American codes are even allowing for high grade reinforcement up to 100 KSI. So that is like even close to 700 megapascal in the SI units. The obvious benefits are your member sizes come less, there is less tonnage, the congestion reduces, and the negatives are these high grade seals are less ductile. So for seismic design, they have some limitations, and they need longer laps. But then nowadays everybody uses couplers, mechanical couplers, so even that is taken care of. And in case of concrete, we have really a high grade of concrete. Like earlier, there was M25, 30 grade. So that is like cube strength. That was really common. Now there is facility to even get really high grade strength up to 70, 80, and even 100 at places where the labs make these cube tests, they test it, and we can use it. And this has really pushed the limits for tall buildings. And wherever the tall building is constructed, it is obviously determined by whatever is the local availability of aggregates. Only one penalty in case of using high grade concrete is the codes usually limit the ratio of the concrete grade of verticals and the concrete grade of floors. So there is on site, they need to puddle extra concrete around the vertical elements, and this takes some time. But anyway, these logistics all need to be worked out in the concept stage, taking into account all stakeholders of the project. We can look at what are the different gravity load resisting systems that are common. So this particular table, I've tried my best to capture all in one go. So ranging from flat slabs again can be in pure reinforced concrete, or it can be a post-tension slab. Again, a flat slab can be a flat plate or a flat plate with drop panels. We can have a waffle slab over here for larger spans. And the last three are typical that we see even in low-rise construction, slab with beams, two-way slabs, and for larger spans, we can have slabs with secondary beams. If you look at pros and cons of each, right? I'll come to that again in the next slide. So flat slabs or flat plate with drops, these have really slim floors. The advantage obviously is the formwork or the shuttering material is very simple to construct, ease of constructability. They are quicker to construct. They lead to lower story heights. I'll tell you what are the advantages of lower story heights. And also there is flexibility of partitions. On the con side, openings in slabs could be a concern. These slabs tend to deflect a lot. So there is a quite rigorous checks that need to be done for the deflections. But all in all, they are like quite popular in our country now. The waffle slabs are complex in that from the shuttering point of view. Whenever you have beams, right? Beams take a lot of time to form. A lot of time goes in fixing the reinforcement and doing the concreting of that beam. So although material wise, the last four options, material wise, they probably may consume less material, but the cons are that fixing the formwork takes a lot of time, and this delays the construction. And we'll see why is it important to not delay the construction in the further slides. So a floor system, when it comes to planning a floor, right? And if it's a tall building, the whole focus needs to be on how do we make it easily buildable, okay? So the grid lines need to be as simple as possible. When you say simple, I'm not talking about just squarish or rectangularish grid. You can go for any kind of grids, but it needs to be simple and clearly defined, like re-entrant corners and things like that. If it is avoided, it's best, but we can work around that. the whole focus has to be on reducing construction time. And that is where an architect can sit with the structural engineer, and together they can do wonders. Like, I'll give you just a brief example. A single day, usually when we go with flat slabs without any beams, we can construct single floors within 3.5 to 4 days. That's really very easy, as opposed to 7 days, 8 days with beam slab construction. So a single day saving in a slab cycle, say for an example, 60 stories, right? It's like you are finishing the project 60 days in advance. So that's like 2 months. And just imagine the amount of interest that the developer is paying, that person saves on that interest when the building is delivered 60 days in advance. And this itself might lead into 20-30% of saving in the structural cost of the floor. Other important aspect is the whole focus needs to be on minimizing the inter-story height, and the floor needs to be as slim as possible. Like, the spans and the design needs to be most efficient. Like, you need to maximize spans with the most slimmest slab. That's where the structural engineer comes into the play. And minimizing the inter-story height usually has a cascading effect on the cost of the structure. So not only it, say, reduces in the structural quantity of the verticals, but apart from that, even if you save, say, 100 or a 50 of floor height in a 100 story tower, it is going to reduce the facade quantity, because now my facade surface area will reduce. There will be savings in the MEP, so the vertical transportation, the plumbing, pipes, the electrical cables, and all quantities will be less. Furthermore, lesser heights will also attract lesser wind loads, and you may require a smaller core to resist the wind load. And when you say a smaller core, it means that you have more lettable area, of course. So that is how a floor design is really important. So the cascading effect is possible in a good floor design. So ideally, what I would say is that from the strength point of view, although the lateral system needs to be efficient, the floor system is equally important, because it need not be overlooked. As we see, a well-designed, efficient floor system has a multiple cascading effect on the cost of the project, and you can do wonders by having a good floor system in place. Moving on to the lateral load resisting systems, I'll just briefly take you through what is the function of a lateral load resisting system. So basically, you have a gravity system in place. The gravity system needs to be braced, and that's where the lateral load resisting system comes into the play. They provide stability to the frame that provides gravity loads. It resists the wind, seismic, and the soil loads. This is required in each direction, and not to forget, even in the torsional direction. So the building not only needs to be have enough resistance along the X and Y axis, but then also rotationally it needs to be stable. My further slides will talk about why this rotation is also critical. We can mix and match multiple types in a same building, and obviously the system that we take, it depends on what is the use and the occupancy, what is the building size, what is the type of construction and location. So for a layman who is not really who doesn't do structural design, the action is such that whenever you have a wind load, the wind load comes on the cladding. The cladding spans between the floors, successive floors, and that's where the cladding distributes the load to the floor diaphragm, and the floor diaphragm in turn, it distributes the load to the vertical resisting system in place. And these are like cantilever from the foundation. These, in this example, I've made use of these red shear walls, and these shear walls, that's how the load reaches the shear walls. So the load that was applied on the cladding via the floor diaphragm has reached the shear wall, and the shear wall in turn distributes the load at the foundation and then to the ground. The selection of lateral system, it depends on the magnitude of seismic loads, what kind of stiffness and drift limitations are imposed on the building. And more importantly, it's not just the vertical elements like the shear wall or frames that are the lateral load system. The horizontal diaphragm, which I said, like you have these slabs, right? This is also important because this diaphragm is the one that distributes load. Without the diaphragm, the load won't go onto the lateral system. So many times what happens is we receive plans where, there are a lot of openings in the diaphragm. So if there are a lot of substantial openings in the diaphragm, the load is not going to reach the lateral system, in this case, the shear walls. So this needs to be known. The horizontal diaphragm is also equally important. Other thing is between what primarily differentiates the wind and seismic is in wind loads, it's an externally applied load that are transferred from cladding to the diaphragm based on the tributary area, and whereas for seismic loads, it's the internally generated inertia forces that are based on the mass of the building. To understand a very like a basic level understanding of a diaphragm, that's how a diaphragm works in plan view. It's how you analyze beams, that it's like a deep beam. It flexes whenever you have this lateral load coming on the floor plan from wind. It flexes between the lateral load resisting elements, and that's how it transfers the load to the shear wall. If you provide any openings over here, this load path is broken, and in that case, the load won't go to the shear wall. So this is an important element that needs to be understood. Let us look at the various lateral load resisting systems. For low-rise buildings, we have moment frames in steel, concrete, or composite. We can have shear walls, again in concrete, masonry, wood, and steel plate, or brace frames in steel or composite. In steel, brace frames come in two forms. One is a concentric brace framing, and one is an eccentric brace framing. Both can work depending on the seismic zone and type. And the sizing of this is usually controlled by strength. Moment frames are essentially rigid frames. So, in the whole strength and stiffness of that frame depends on how rigid this joint is. So this connection is really important. The more stiffer the connection, the stiffer is the frame. And in concrete, steel, or steel composite, it can be done. In concrete, we have typical some details that we need to follow at the joint that essentially maintains the 90-degree angle at the connection and maintain the rigidity. In steel or composite, it's a combination of welded or bolted connections with the flanges. For high-rise buildings, it's just I would say a further, like a kind of a post-graduation from the basic systems. But the concept remains the same. You have tube systems, you have brace tube systems, outrigger systems, and core systems. If you see, a core is nothing but shear walls. All shear walls coming together form a core, and we'll see that in the next slides. This is a good image that shows what kind of systems are usually followed for buildings with different height. So moment frames are some that work between, say, 20 to 40 stories. They easily work. Moment frames with shear walls, they work, say, up to 50 to 60 stories. The core, this particular zone between 40 and 60 stories is usually a practical limit of the core. And most of our buildings that have been happening around us, they are either they have the core, or if it's taller than this, you have the outrigger brace structure. So I'll talk about it in the slides further. What is an outrigger? What does it do? And the red line is somewhere where the buildings are classified as super tall. So basically, out in case of an outrigger system, what we have a central spine core over here, and at fixed levels, we have floor deep or multiple floor deep beams, which are either walls or bracing. We use that and tie it with the perimeter columns. So what essentially happens is that the core is usually when the core is less, when the area of the core, whatever we are provided, or rather when the extents of the core are not enough, when we connect it with these walls, what is happening is the essential the base width that we engage is increasing. Earlier, when I talked about, the slenderness ratio, 13:1. So essentially what we are doing here is we are engaging even the gravity columns over here with the core. So as such, the whole width of the structure is now resisting the lateral loads. So we can see that the effect, the dotted blue line is the deflection without the outriggers, and this reduces substantially with the green line whenever you have the outrigger incorporated. And also the over here, the dotted blue line would have been the moment demand on the core, and the moment we connect it with the outriggers, that's how the moment demand on the core reduces. So essentially just treat it like the more, like if a person is standing right on his 2 feet, if the 2 feet are really close to each other and a person pushes that person is going to topple off. But if the person spreads his or her feet wide, it is difficult to get that person toppled off. That is what exactly is the principle in place. That's how the outrigger behaves. At the very early on in the project, the structural engineers sit down with the architects and the MEP consultants, because the locations of these outrigger walls, I mean, it's not something like the structural engineer decides directly that, okay, on this floor we'll put the outriggers. This needs to be properly planned. So in a tall building, you have many such provisions of inhabitable spaces, such as the MEP zones, the fire check floors, that these are usually good locations where that can accommodate these outriggers. And sometimes, at the concept level, the engineer sits down with the architect and the MEP person, and they target the planning in such a way that if a fire check floor or a mechanical floor has to be moved up and down somewhere along the elevation, that can be done. All this can be done in the concept stage. Looking at the tube systems, these are usually it's the perimeter of the structure that comes in place. Tube, the figure to the right usually shows how a tube structure looks like. They consist of closely spaced columns that are 6 to 12 feet spaced, and they're connected by deep girders or beams that span 6 to 12 feet, and the depth of these are roughly 3 to 5 feet. In this case, the entire lateral load resistance is concentrated on the perimeter of the tower. And you see with this arrow, whatever is the wind load, you have compression on the far face and tension at the rear face. The stiffness of the girders, they cause shear lag. And usually we have seen that the columns in the corner are usually heavier than the intermediate columns. Another system is a tube in tube. In this case, not only we have a perimeter tube, but we also have a central core. So the central core and the perimeter tube, they act together. They interact, and this interaction between the external tube and the internal tube depends on the type of floor diaphragm between the two. This is another variation, in which case if a tube or a tube in tube is not enough, one can go with a brace tube. The brace tube is such that again you have this closely spaced columns and diagonal bracing is added to the perimeter. It's further stiffer, and the bracing even redistributes uneven gravity loads onto the columns. I mean, this is a bit difficult to apply in residential buildings, but in commercial buildings it can be done. And further, the architect needs to know there are ways of visually expressing these diagonals. If that is achievable, you can do wonders with this system. The last, I would say, at the top, what I will say, bucket is a bundle tube. That's where a cluster of tubes come together. They connect, as I've shown. At different levels, there could be different setbacks. Imagine it's like a multi-cell perforated box girder. Such kind of a system has a very high torsional resistance, and there is a modularity in functional planning that's possible. These are usually seen in really super tall or mega tall buildings, and not in the commonly occurring tall buildings. Now, having gone through the various lateral systems, let's look at the important aspect, which is the structural core and why is it important. So first and foremost, it's a place where a lot of time goes, a lot of money is burnt, and we need to be efficient in planning this core. So the size and location is generally dictated by the architects. Uh, so wherever the services are and how the space planning goes on, that's where the core is possible. There will be few initial inputs from the core, from the structural consultant on this core. Now, why is this important? So let's go and look at the logistics of the net lettable area. So if you have a structure of, given envelope, okay, or a given fixed area, that's the area of the floor plate is fixed, then the floor efficiency is usually judged on what is the net lettable area, or what, as a developer, what are you getting from the space that is lettable, or what is rentable. Okay, so in many building bylaws and guidelines in different countries, including our country, the area that is occupied by the core is either not considered or it is partially considered in this calculations. So so obviously what you're doing is you require a core. You require a core to stabilize a tall tower, but then you are unable to sell or count that area as a selling factor, right? So the whole target is to minimize the core area and maximize the net lettable area. And all this needs to be done within the available envelope of the building. These are the constraints, or this is a typical standard, I would say, constraint of our tall building problem. And if one tackles this problem at the very start, the project is a huge success, not only from the building point of view, but also from the commercial viability of the project. Ultimately, we are, as a team, we are responsible to make the project commercially viable, right? If the project is commercially viable, is not viable, there is no point on doing that project. So at the very early stage, it is necessary to take inputs from the structural engineer, the MEP, and the vertical transportation for this. This is a brief, I would say, enlarged image of the typical structural core. That's how it looks. You have all these banks of elevators that are required. The staircases are planned here. Pressurization shafts are all going into the core, or services go in and out from this. And that's how a core looks. Now, if you see all these cores, they are essentially shear walls. So shear walls are connected together with some fusing elements. I'll talk about these elements that form the core. Now, what are these elements? These elements are link beams, these small elements that I've shown here between the pink lines. These are beams, and usually they are the Achilles heel. A core can be only as strong as how strong that particular Achilles heel or that link beam is. So imagine you're tying this core. The core is not, the wall is not continuous, right? These are like punctures or openings in the core. And the structural element, or the link beam, what we call, the strength and the stiffness of the link beam is going to dictate how strong or weak this core is. So imagine two extreme cases. Say the link beam depth is, say, something like say 20 inches, and or 24 inches deep. And as opposed to that, consider the link beam depth as same as the slab thickness. So say if I'm having an 8-inch slab around, you have the link beam depth same as a slab. So the two extreme cases, on one side, when the 8-inch slab is there, the link beam is essentially not a link beam. It doesn't link the cores, and each wall then acts individually. And we don't want to have that. The whole idea is to increase the extent of the core. And so the deeper the link beam, the more efficient the core is. So that's what I meant, that the stiffness and strength of this link beam will usually go a long way in dictating what is the core efficiency, in the point of structural point of view. The MEP sleeves, if any, they need to be strategically located. So it is very easier to give the sleeves in beams that just take gravity loads. But when you have this core, the lateral system, there are certain target areas where we allow sleeves, or if that is not allowed, then the architect and the MEP, they need to plan on getting the sleeves from somewhere else. probably get it through the wall instead of the link beam. And other services like HVAC and all, they need proper planning. We cannot provide like ducts through these link beams. Usually allowance needs to be made. So the duct needs to go in the area available between the soffit of this link beam and the false ceiling. That's where the ductwork goes in. Other important aspect is the buildability of the core. As I said, that improving on that slab cycle time and how to manage the material involved in building that core, that is critical. And there are various systems in place, like you have the jump form system, the slip form, or the alu form system. Like what happens in a jump form is like I've shown some images. You have 4 floors that are enveloped with a cage of shuttering and false work, and this whole system jumps hydraulically level by level, or 4 floors at a time, and the slabs get casted in one go, multiple levels. In slip form construction, although it's not that traditionally happening now, that's when this particular cage goes ahead at a very specific rate per time duration, and it goes on climbing. And alu form is something which is again more prevalent these days. It's various companies such as Maiwan, they sell this. There are other companies also that do aluminum formwork. It's a system of formwork where all the walls, the slabs, beams are cast in one go. The whole floor is back propped, and the whole shuttering gets moved to the other level in 3 to 4 days. Now let us focus on some aspects that are really specific to tall buildings. It's a bit technical, but let me tell you how architecturally it affects. So there is usually what happens is, as we go tall, there is a sustained load that is acting on all verticals. So ultimately, each member, each vertical element, it kind of deforms actually. So what happens is this deformation is dependent on the area of that element. So if I'm having a core has a very large area, the core deforms at a lesser rate, whereas the perimeter columns, they have a lesser area and they deform at a higher rate. So ultimately what happens is 120, this is just an enlarged image. A 120-story building, when it deforms, it will look something like this. And then there needs to be corrections that have to be applied, because obviously all the facade and the MEP vertical elements, but MEP what do you call MEP components and all, they are fixed in size, right? So all these need to be taken care of. So what we do is we usually do a rigorous analysis, and we give a compensation to these floors. So the contractor takes our compensation data, and they build each floor at certain levels up, assuming that after the whole tower is constructed, the tower will go back to the level that is being planned. This is a highly technical side, but just to cover this aspect, it's dependent on time, it's dependent on creep, the age of loading, the relative humidity, the volume to surface ratio, the reinforcement ratio, and also the shrinkage on concrete. Now the high impact decisions at the time of planning is we need to keep columns as far away as possible from the core. And also the idea is to mobilize equal loads on these vertical elements, because no matter what you do, this axial shortening is always going to happen. The whole idea is that there shouldn't be much relative axial shortening between two close elements. That's the whole goal of this. A brief talk on the foundations. Foundations of these tall buildings are typically in the form of either mat that rests on the farm strata directly, or on piles. The foundation thickness varies anything from 1.5 meters to 5 meters, depending on the tower height, spans, the strata encountered. And these are really thick concrete sections, like 4 and 5 meters. You talked, it's a very thick section. Our concrete specifications cover it. The specifications should cover the maximum allowable temperature and temperature differential within the mat. So what happens is the heat of hydration plays a role and cracks are seen. We need to avoid that. Sometimes ice flakes are used to cool down. Special curing methods need to be adopted. The mix design is adjusted to accommodate use of fly ash, slag, and microsilica. Usually you have MEP services, and that's where we sometimes give 300 mm to 500 mm of plum concrete or lean mixed concrete over the top of the foundation, so that the MEP contractor can come later and they can just bury their services through these. So you need to pay attention to the top of the foundation. And sometimes, the strata is such that you need to go really low, or the excavation needs to, you need to really excavate more. If that is the case, the architect and the developer can take this input from the structural engineer, and they can think of planning a basement. So it's like, if you are excavating or going down, sometimes it's feasible to accommodate services or parking or anything when you go down. So as long as the plot dimensions allow it, all these points can be considered in the concept. This was all about what attention needs to be given on the tower. But rarely do towers are like standalone. Usually they are accompanied by the non-tower or the podiums or the extended podiums and the basements. So sometimes whatever decisions we take in the tower also affects the non-tower. So we'll see what is that. The planning of the non-tower usually depends on the type of development. One may have a single tower with an associated podium basement, or one can have a cluster of towers in a gated development with associated podium and basements. That's where you need to watch out for expansion joints or movement joints, because say if you are having a 200 meters by 200 meters of plot with multiple towers, usually there is a huge study goes on whether to give an expansion joint or a movement joint. Expansion joints are best when they are placed at every 60 to 70 meters. They relieve the thermal stresses or stresses due to shrinkage and other constraints. However, treating the expansion joints is usually an art, and if the local workmanship is not a good skilled workmanship is not available, one would then go for connecting the non-tower together, but then there are cost implications of that. So a fully connected tower, the engineer needs to do a more rigorous analysis, and the reinforcement required is more in that case. Or if you want to reduce the reinforcement and still go for a fully connected tower, the engineer may specify a shrinkage reducing admixtures in place, but these are typically costly. So all these decisions, whether to go for an expansion joint or not, we need to weigh in at the concept stage. Furthermore, what about the stability of the non-tower? So when we spoke about stability of the tower, the lateral system, which is the shear walls or the tubes or the core, usually what we have seen is the non-tower stability. If you hard connect it with the tower lateral system is strong enough to even take care of the non-tower. So that's when the non-tower would not require a separate lateral system, and it can just have gravity columns in place. But sometimes we have seen that you encounter really extended, eccentric locations of towers with the non-towers. That's when an additional lateral load resisting system is required, and you may find structural engineers demanding that. So we need to give thought to that at very early on. I also covered again in the previous slide, the tower foundation types also dictate planning of non-tower. So if more excavation is required for a firm strata, adding a basement can be leveraged effectively. And to save time, often many levels of tower go ahead of the non-tower. The non-tower takes time to construct. There is a lot of excavation associated with the non-tower, and that's when you can mobilize the tower construction in advance. if you have really deep basements, you can also use a combination of top-down construction and bottom-up construction. So it's something which is regularly done in regions such as Hong Kong and China regions, where the basements are like 4 and 5 story basements, and they do simultaneously top-down and bottom-up construction for the non-tower and tower respectively. This was the code that has come out in 2017, which is the tall building code, IS 16700. Before that, there was no dedicated code for the tall buildings, and a lot of clauses were formulated. And what we observed is that like the architects who are in the industry, it was something new to them. And the code writers have done a really great job in getting this code in place. So any layman in this field who need not have a structural background can go through the code, and there are certain prescriptive provisions. If you follow them, the building will behave well. Some of these prescriptive guidelines, I'm saying, like the code has given what are the maximum height limits. So depending on the seismic zone, whether it's zone 2, 3, 4, or 5, and depending on the structural system in place, whether it's a moment frame or a structural wall, or a structural wall plus moment frame, or a structural wall with frame tube, the code tells us what are the different applicable heights. So if you are having a structural wall with a frame tube and you are having, say, seismic zone 3, you can go to a maximum height of 250 meter, as long as you follow other prescriptive guidelines given by this code. This is a good place to start at the very concept stage. It's a good guidance, and it's all useful information in there, and all stakeholders, if they're aware of this, it's really great. Other thing was the aspect ratio, or the maximum slenderness limit, which I talked earlier. So for different systems, again, what is the maximum permissible aspect ratio or slenderness limit? The code talks about it, somewhere between 4 and 5 for moment frames to 10 for a structural wall plus frame tube. Other than these, there is also good guidance given on what is the maximum allowable openings in a floor diaphragm. So as I said, a floor diaphragm is critical because the floor diaphragm carries the load from the wind and distributes it to the lateral element. Now, if someone gives a lot of cutouts and a lot of big openings for MEP or elevate or staircases or something like that, one needs to be wary of what is the maximum allowable opening in a floor diaphragm. The code gives good guidance on that. There are good guidelines given for acceptable irregularities in the code and what penalty needs to be paid if you have these irregularities. Other thing is also the demand for a perimeter frame. So in some of the examples that I've said, that I presented later, I'll tell you what a perimeter frame does. But before looking at the perimeter frame, let's understand why torsional stiffness is important. So first and foremost, when a person perceives what kind of resistance is required, usually it's the X and Y directions where you demand the lateral load resisting systems like walls or moment frames. But a torsional resistance is like it dictates the ability of the tower to twist, and twist is something that needs to be avoided. You cannot avoid it, but you can minimize the twist. So first and foremost, from seismic point of view, damage caused where twisting is susceptible, we have seen far more damage. So that's why the structure needs to be stiffer from torsional point of view. And even from the wind acceleration point of view, just imagine you are living in a 100-story tall building, and say you are residing on the 100th floor. Okay, now the acceleration, imagine you are having 3 components to the acceleration. One is X and one is Y. So if you move along X direction, if you accelerate along X direction, or you accelerate along Y direction, the acceleration that you perceive is going to be different. But just imagine on the 100th floor, you are sitting on a couch, and suddenly the floor plate twists. Okay, there is a torsion, and suddenly the building in front of you, it gets angularly displaced. So the human being will perceive it quite differently when there is a twist. So that's why a structure needs to have a good torsional resistance. These are three very basic figures just for understanding point of purpose. You have figure A, B, and C. All are shear walls. So in figure A, you have two shear walls in Y direction and two shear walls in X direction. There is good resistance along X and Y, but the torsional resistance of this floor plate is zero. This floor plate has zero torsional resistance and it's unstable, because you see the line of action all pass through one point, which is at the center. If someone comes and twists, gives a small twisting force to this plate will go on twisting infinitely and it will be unstable. As opposed to this, if you see figure B, it has a somewhat better torsional resistance. It has walls in X and Y direction. And now compared to this, if you try to twist this floor plate in plan, you see these two walls will offer resistance because they're far away from each other, and they will offer a reactive couple. And if you see item C, it's more torsional. It has the highest torsional resistance, where you have two banks of walls separated by a good distance. This was in short about torsion. I'll also come to this torsion issue again in one of the examples that I've shown. Let me take you quickly through three examples just from different projects. This is a hotel building which is in a high seismic zone. It's 37 stories above grade and 3 basement levels. The total height is around 450 feet and plus from the grade to the top. There is a marquee feature at the top. Typical floor height is 10 feet. This is a really slim floor. If you see floor to floor height of 10 feet, if you see, there is a huge optimization that's gone in there on the floor slab. The planned dimensions are roughly 70 feet by 265 feet. This was a cast in place concrete construction with flat plate that are post tensioned, and shear walls are used for lateral resistance. It's on a mat foundation and there is a seismic joint. This is the 3D view. So this is the tower. There is a seismic joint with a conference center. These are the typical, this is quite a sleek kind of a structure. If you see the floor plate dimension 70 by 265, the grid spacing along X axis is roughly 22 feet, and along the Y direction, it's around 30 feet, 28 to 32 feet. The lateral resistance is provided by the core. The core provides the lateral resistance. And you know, this floor plate, right? This has a huge arm. So the floor can twist around this core. And to arrest this twisting, we have given gable-ended blade walls. So they help in giving a good torsional resistance. So if the floor tries to twist right around the core, the blade walls, whatever is the distance between the blade walls, that distance into the resistance of the blade walls gives the torsional restoring force. These are the typical, core layouts and the wall layouts at different levels, the typical levels. Another project is a residential plus hotel building. This is ultra luxury high rise, 750 feet tall. It's quite tall. It has 55 floors, a crown, and 2 basements. The purpose of this tower was used for condos, apartments, and hotel floors. Again, this has a really slim floor. Again, over here, it's like 10.5 feet is the floor to floor height that was achieved. These are PT flat slabs with perimeter columns. And in this case, the central core was not enough, and we had made use of outrigger walls that connected the central core with the perimeter column. These are the tentative dimensions, 110 feet by 195 feet. So if you see, the core dimension was roughly 30 feet. If we just depended on the core for stability, the aspect ratio or the slenderness ratio of the core would have been 750 by 30. That's like quite a lot more than 20, I would say. And that was not enough. That's why we increased the resistance by engaging the outrigger. So ultimately, the aspect ratio of the tower became 750 divided by 110. So that's somewhere around 7 to 7.5, and that helped. This is a residential project here. It's not really ultra high rise, but it's still tall building. It's a 90-meter tall building. It has 28 floors and one basement. These are residential apartments, and most of this construction is done using aluform. This doesn't have a flat slab. This has a beam slab system. The spans are also in the range of 3 to 5 meters, but again, really thin slabs, 5-inch slabs and 6-inch slabs over here. In this case, primarily, again, you have central core that are coupled with these blue elements. These are the link beams. And then you have distributed walls everywhere. And apart from that, to have a good torsional resistance, you also have a perimeter frame. So this perimeter frame also helps in having a good torsional resistance, and the distance between the two perimeter frame is roughly 21 meters. I think that's about it. And to summarize the presentation, what did we learn, or what were the structural cost and high impact decisions that affected structural cost that we need to take care of? So first thing is obviously have a reasonable aspect ratio. So at least have a ratio such that even if the core alone doesn't work, the building envelope is such that the engineer can use of other measures such as outriggers or tubes or moment frames, and get a good aspect ratio less than 13, or that table which I presented in the tall building code. The gravity and the lateral system, if you integrate them, right, if you link them wherever possible, it helps in reducing the foundation demands. So as in the case of outrigger buildings, right, the core is the lateral element. We connected it with the outrigger. The outrigger was another lateral element. We connected it with the perimeter column. So once you integrated it, this helped in reducing the demand on the foundation, and this in turn helped in reducing the cost. Achieve a symmetry as much as possible in geometry as well as stiffness over the height. Ensure that the tower verticals are equally stressed to avoid issues of tilt and differential shortening. So if one side of the tower is more stressed on the other, the tower will try to lean on that other side, and we don't want these problems. Constructing a leaning tower is costly, and we don't want that to happen. The center of mass needs to be as close to the center of stiffness. This is one guiding principle where the torsional effect can be minimized. Also, a good resistance need to be provided from the torsion point of view. A good lateral system needs to be provided at the perimeter if required, and if the core is not enough alone. The floor plate and the core needs to be as simple as possible to ensure quick buildability. Usually speaking, flat slab is the quickest. Whenever you have beams take more time to form. So a lot of time goes in there. Flat slab is quicker to construct. Avoid transfer structures. They add to the time as well as the cost. A lot of time goes in building, in having a transfer structure. Also explore opportunities to jump from the core or use aluform. They are fast, quick. A 4-day slab cycle can be achieved in a jump form construction, and around 7 to 10 days is achieved in aluform construction, or a mix of two also is good. From the partition point of view, the whole aim is to reduce the weight on the structure. Lesser the weight, lesser is the quantity, and that's where lightweight partitions instead of brickwork, they help. The load is like 1/3 of the brick roughly. External walls again can be in terms of non-structural walls in concrete. They don't need additional plastering, so that plastering activity at the external phase is completely eliminated. One can also go for precast walls, precast hollow core walls for internal partitions. They are really lightweight. That could be an option. Again, shape. When you're shaping the tower, you look at the lower perimeter by area ratios. They tend to be more economical. So before you try and do a cruciform shape, just make sure that you have exhausted all other possible shapes that are simpler. And once you have exhausted that option, then only go for a complex shape. So it's not that complex shapes are not allowed. This is just what I'm saying is dictates the economy. Early collaboration, it is important. It's absolutely important at the very concept stage. So and this ideally should not be a problem in this era where you have a lot of networking and where different teams come together, and at a very early on in the concept and the pre-concept stage, they sit together, take a tracing paper, look at the drawing, and formulate the strategy for core, formulate the strategy for vertical transportation, and in general planning, the functional planning. This needs to be done sitting with the architect and the MEP consultant. And obviously a poorly conceptualized tall building is always going to be an expensive one. So all these things need to be catered at the very concept stage. Once you pass on this concept stage and go further, it is very difficult to come back and rectify it. A lot of effort goes there to rectify it, because it's again a cascading effect, right? It's like you lock in the areas, the structure goes under RERA, you cannot come back and easily change it. So a lot of disciplines involved, a lot of planning and time spent. So get it right. Maybe take more time for the concept, but get it right in the first place. So getting it right in the concept is the most critical activity in this project. Yeah, and that's all. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, sir. Now it's time for question and answers. So students, faculties, those who have any doubts or any queries can type in chat box or can directly ask. You can raise your hand so that very good presentation, sir.
Thank you.
It was very simple.
Hello.
I hope it helps your coursework. Hi.
Yeah.
Hello, sir. So I wanted to ask, like, how do we provide or where do we provide the shear walls? Like in the diagram, you showed the shear walls were provided in the end and or in the course. Like where all we provide shear walls exactly?
Right. So there are different, I would say, different repercussions to that, and depends on the type of building. I believe your question is more, I would say, uh, uh, related to this tall building. For short buildings, it is treated differently. So for a tall building, again, you need to take into account like the shear wall. The core is usually centrally located. It acts as a center point where all the transportation, vertical transportation, and all takes place, and all the planning. The rest of the area is free for you to plan. So that is a good place to start generally for a tall building.
From the core. Okay.
Yeah.
Hello. Good afternoon, Aditya sir.
Yeah, good afternoon.
Very fruitful input from your structural point of view from your side. I have a question related to shear wall again. Now we saw the shear wall in the core and the peripheral as well. But is there any thumb rule that how much surface area we should consider compared to the overall building envelope while designing building, high-rise building?
I would say you need to look at again the slenderness ratio. So if you say if you're planning a core, so the surface area is usually it will be given to you by the structural engineer. But if you what you need to think is from an architect point of view, what is important is the space occupied by the core. Okay.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
So if you have the space occupied by the core somewhere in the ratio of say somewhere between say 8 to 9, usually that will work, or sometimes even 10, depends on the height. So again, this is like happens exponentially. So for example, for a 30-story building, if the extent of the core is such that the height to the base of the core is in the ratio of 10, it is possible to make it work. But the same thing, if you go for a 300-meter tower or a 60 to 70-story building, a height to base ratio of 10 may not work. But then again, if you that can be, I would say, further enhanced by providing outriggers or something like that, if the grids are well arranged in line. So a starting point of 8 to 10 is a good start, where you can assume that the space has gone for the core.
Okay. I have another question. Nowadays, most of the building in the world actually having two twin towers or two similar kind of towers, and they are connected at different levels. Or a particular building having a big opening within a building itself at maybe 100th floor or the 70th floor. Is that act as a challenge for the structural design, or it act as an advantage for the structural design?
I would say it's a designable challenge. It's not that great a challenge. So I mean, there are only two ways about it. So if it's required functionally, it is required functionally. Now, two ways to deal with it is I either give a movement joint between the two, so that that particular connecting element is connected to one part of the tower and it's free to slide from the other part. That's the most simplest thing. But again, as I said, treating these movement joints is a bit tricky, and all depends on what is the spans and widths of that connecting platform. We may even go and connect it. As such, it's what you have asked is not a challenge. It's quite regularly done. It's a designable challenge. So from the architect's point of view, what I would say is a structural engineer may just guide you on what could be the possible, spans and the widths of those floors. But it is a designable one.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, sir.
Hi.
It was a very good presentation, sir. I had a doubt. The floating column concept. So, how can we apply it in the residential projects? Like, is it workable in residential projects? The hanging column or the floating column?
Yeah, it is done. The code has a statement which says floating column cannot be a part of the lateral system. So it's just that. So if it's purely from gravity perspective, floating columns are fine. They can be done. Again, it depends on how sensitive that building is. If it's in a very high seismic zone, it is best to be avoided, because usually gravity columns get they are critical for progressive collapse of the building, and if anything happens to the floating column, there is a cascading effect. It can still be done. It's better avoided in a high seismic zone. If it's say low to moderate seismic zone, as long as it's a gravity column, that can be planned. It's just that when I said it adds to the cost, so the floating column as such doesn't add to the cost. It's the forming the transfer slab or the transfer beam or the transfer girder that adds a lot to the cost. There are challenges in that. We do it many times, but when a simpler thing is to avoid it and look in different ways, that is the preferred route. But to answer your question, it can be done.
Okay, sir. Okay. Sir, and one more question I have. While designing the plans in the residential project, now we are starting the residential project in this semester. So, while starting the design, we are stuck in the column positioning. Like we can't progress in design because of the column positions. So first we have to decide the column positions and then go ahead with the planning, or can it be reversed? Like, what is a good start to go about the column positioning? And also, we have a basement also to be designed in this project. So, keeping in mind that the columns will be continuing from top to bottom. So, how should we go about, and which plan should be designed first? Like, should we go from bottom to top or top to bottom?
Yeah, that's a good question. So first and foremost, both need to be looked together. Take a tracing paper, start with the, I would say, first you have information, right? What is a car park? If your basement is used for a car park, so say 2.5 meters is say an area, 2.5 meter width is, I'm just taking a number, okay? 2.5 meter width car park you have. So having a column in the superstructure in multiples of 2.5 is definitely going to help. Now, if you already know that you have a 2.5 meter car park, and if your column grid spacing is in multiples of 2 meters, you're surely going to end up in some trouble somewhere. So this thing needs to be looked at both at a time. Regarding the superstructure, I would say uh, the best way is to have columns at the perimeter as much as possible. It's a clean solution from architectural point of view. There is a lot of flexibility between the core and the column that happens. A lot of things can be planned, and if required, the perimeter can also be engaged with the moment frame later by the engineer for torsional resistance. So this is the type of arrangement that you need to do.
Sir, and the spaces wherein we want to avoid the columns, can we provide shear walls there?
I think this needs to be looked in some context. I guess I don't think there's a general. Yeah. So when I said column, it's a column or a wall. It's a vertical element for me.
Okay, okay.
So I mean, if the width of the column is a problem, that can always be converted to a wall. If that answers your question, I mean.
Yeah, yeah, okay.
Good afternoon, Mr. Karpe. I'd like to ask a question.
Sure.
One of your slides you had mentioned, firstly, let me congratulate you. It was an excellent presentation and very, very informative. And thank you so much for it. I just want to ask you, in one of your slides, you mentioned that the walls should be constructed of lightweight materials. So do you propose that we don't use brickwork at all, or what is it?
Yeah, so right now, what the trends are happening, instead of brickwork, the density of brickwork with plaster and all comes about to be in the range of 20, 21, somewhere between 18 to 21 kilonewton per cubic meter. That is getting replaced by autoclaved aerated blocks. So these are lightweight blocks. Materially, they may be slightly costlier than bricks, but the size of the block is almost 3 times that of the brick. So it gets constructed faster. The weight wise, its density is 7.5 kilonewton per cubic meter. So that is roughly anywhere between 1/3 to half the weight of the brick. So the constructions in the tall buildings that is happening, when I said don't brickwork can be avoided and lightweight, I was talking about these blocks, or obviously if it's a commercial building, then like a drywall or POP type stud wall that can be used.
Is this throughout the construction or is it only on the periphery?
The AAC blocks, right? The autoclaved aerated blocks are at both internal as well as external.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Aditya sir, I have one question. What type of structural system, efficient structural system will you suggest for a building? Like we gave height restriction from 35 meter to 75 meter for this project. So what type of structural system will you suggest for this?
So you,
And foundation.
obviously, without looking at the plan, not much I can do. But generally speaking, for this height, say up to 70 meters, usually a well-distributed walls with, say, central core that uses 2 or 4 elevators. That is quite typically done.
And for this a housing project. So
Okay.
and the type of foundation again next to that.
So again, it depends on what kind of soil strata we have. I mean, it can be anywhere between, if it's a really good soil strata, we can have individual spread footings. Or if the soil strata is not so great and it's somewhere medium, we can have a matte foundation that covers.
And with the structural system, again, the column size will change. The type of structural system will be having.
Yes.
So we can't have any thumb rule for that, for assuming a column size.
Not really difficult to say that. It depends on various factors, because if you are having distributed walls, it also not only is the gravity loads, but it's the wind loads also come into the play, lateral loads. I think you can reach at certain, I would say, I wouldn't say thumb rules of sizing, but thumb rules of structural wall plan density. So in each direction, somewhere between 1.5 to 2.5% of the floor area, that could be a starting point. So I understand, like, from where you're coming from, you need to know that whatever wall layout you have given, how do you ensure that these walls are enough?
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. So from that point of view, somewhere between 1.5, 1.5 to 2.5% of the floor area getting covered by walls in each direction could be a good starting point, I guess. If your walls are usually covering that, then usually there's a high chance for it to work for the building that you said, around 75 to 80 meter.
I have another question. How much does, when we have multiple floors for parking, so do you advise that to go below the ground or above the ground? How much does that affect the structure?
Yeah, so this again needs to be considered in conjunction with the costing exercise needs to be done. So again, what happens is you need to understand whether enough space is available or not, right? So if you say enough space is available for over the ground, then obviously constructing a basement is going to be costly. So that's where is a key decision.
I'm saying, so far as stability is concerned, for the high rise, now these students are definitely going above 35 to 40 meters. So what is more advisable for them to come off the floor or go down into the basement? I mean, does that affect the rigidity and the stability of the structure?
So again, like the question is, this is like in an extended podium or something like that, right? You're saying that the parking and all is happening in the extended podium region, right? And not in the tower region.
Somewhat.
Yeah, so I mean, for full utilization, if you already have a tower raft or something like that, and if you are already say going 4 meters below ground, it is advisable to take help of that one basement. So again, yeah, I mean, I'm not in a position to comment much on what kind of a system needs to be done here, because obviously it depends on the amount of parking numbers and all these things, and it's a very specific question. So I don't think there is a quite straightforward answer. What I meant was that if you're going down already for a raft, you can make use of that basement and plan your parking there. If not, if you're in an area where pile foundations are something that are cheaper, that's when you don't need to go down. You can have a pile cap at the ground level itself, have piles, and then plan all these in the elevated levels. So there is a advantage disadvantage kind of a give and take in both options. Generally speaking, from cost and economy point of view, basement construction always is going to be more costly.
Students, do you have any questions anymore? Any doubts?
Good afternoon, sir. My question is, in one of your plans, I saw cruciform columns. So, sir, is it possible? Our upcoming design project is a residential complex. So, my question was, can we use cruciform columns in a residential complex? But
You're talking
where
about
exactly? Yes, sir.
cruciform columns or cruciform building shape? The plan that I showed was a cruciform building shape.
Okay, so no, but my question was regarding the columns.
Cruciform column, yes, yeah, you can use. I have used it before, although not in a residential project. If it's perfectly planned, I believe you have opportunities to clad it later or keep it exposed. That is your choice. But there is no, as such, what you call, limitations to using that.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Okay, I think I don't see any more questions. So I guess, Madam, what should we
Yeah.
convene?
As I think no more questions are there again. Here we posted a feedback link. So please fill the feedback form. And okay, I was waiting for principal sir, but I think he is in the meeting. So now we will conclude this session. So once again, thank you for a very nice, crisp and informative presentation.
Yeah, thank you.
On behalf of Pimpri Chinchwad Education Trust, S.B. Patil College of Architecture and Design, I, Professor Harshada Vazarkar, take this opportunity to thank our Honorable Chief Guest, Aditya Karve, for making this webinar more knowledgeable. And I am sure that your valuable guidance will definitely help all our young budding architects. We are highly obliged that in spite of your busy schedule, you accepted this invitation and grace this event with your presence and guide our students. You already summarized the point, so I'm not going to summarize it again. Then I would thank all our team, and special thanks to Principal Sonone sir, who took an initiative and making this webinar possible for the students. And we are also thankful to all our participants, budding architects, for their overwhelming response to this webinar. So we'll conclude this session here. Thank you once again. Take care and be safe.
Yeah, thank you. It was a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So
Bye.
participants can leave the meeting.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for all the faculties.